The air in Miller's scrapyard hung thick and heavy, a metallic soup of rust, stale oil, and the ghosts of forgotten labor. It was July of 1973, and the heat radiating off the mountains of dead iron was enough to make a man dizzy. But Silas Blackwood paid it no mind. His eyes were fixed on one thing, a hulking yellow beast half swallowed by weeds and the slow, inevitable decay of time. It was an Alice Chalmers HD-6G crawler loader, or what was left of one, 10 tons of American steel, sitting silent under the Nebraska sun. The bucket, a 2-yard scoop of thick plate, was scarred and bent, its cutting edge worn to a dull crescent. The tracks were tight with rust, the individual pads looking like they'd been welded together by decades of neglect. Paint, what little remained, was a pale, sun-bleached yellow, flaking away to reveal the dark, pitted steel beneath. To anyone else, it was scrap, worth maybe a few $100s by weight. To Silas, it was an answer, a desperate, long-shot, back-breaking answer. He ran a calloused hand over a track sprocket. The teeth were worn, but not stripped. Solid. He ducked under the massive loader arms, their hydraulic cylinders weeping a dark, sticky film of ancient fluid, and peered at the engine. It was a Detroit diesel, a 371, the little brother to the famous Screamin' Jimmy 6-71. 3 cylinders, 2-stroke, a blower whining on the side. It was a simple, rugged engine known for being loud, leaky, and tough as a pine knot. If he could get it to turn over. "Find something you like, Si," a voice grunted behind him. Silas straightened up, wiping a smear of grease from his hand onto his worn denim jeans. Old Man Miller stood there, chewing on an unlit cigar, his face a roadmap of wrinkles carved by 70 years of sun and shrewd deals. "Might have, Walt. What's the story on this old girl?" Miller spat a piece of cigar leaf onto the ground. "That thing? Been sitting there since before the flood of '65. Some contractor went belly up. Bank hauled his equipment here, sold off the good stuff. That one. She had a cracked head even then. Nobody wanted the headache." A cracked head. That was bad, but not impossible. Silas had rebuilt the engine on his Farmall M 3 times. He knew his way around a block and tackle, knew the feel of torquing bolts in the right sequence. "Heard the bank's been sending you letters," Miller said, his voice softening just a fraction. It wasn't gossip, it was a statement of fact in a town where everyone's business was a matter of public record. Silas just nodded, his jaw tight. The farm was his life, his father's life, his grandfather's. 320 acres of good black soil, but 40 of it was a tangled mess of cottonwood, swampy bottomland, and glacial rock that had never seen a plow. The bank didn't care about history. They cared about yield per acre, and Silas's yield, on his usable 280, was just enough to keep his head above water, but never enough to get ahead. The foreclosure notices weren't just paper. They were a countdown timer on his family's legacy. He could hire a man with a dozer to clear that land, but the quotes he'd gotten were astronomical. More money than he'd see in 2 good years. Buying new was a fantasy. That left this, a pile of iron and problems. Just then, a cloud of dust billowed at the entrance to the yard, followed by the glint of chrome and a coat of paint so shiny it hurt the eyes. A brand-new Ford F-250 Ranger pulled up, and Earl Thompson stepped out. Earl was everything Silas was not. His farm, which bordered Silas's to the west, was a showcase. New center pivot irrigation systems, massive grain bins, and a fleet of gleaming international harvester machines that were never ever paid for. Earl sauntered over, a smug grin on his face. He was wearing a clean seed corn cap and a pearl snap shirt. He looked like he'd just stepped out of an air-conditioned office, not a tractor cab. "Well, I'll be," Earl drawled, looking from Silas to the derelict Dozer. "Looking to expand the antique collection, Silas." "Your old farm'll gettin' lonely." Silas ignored the jab. "Just lookin', Earl." "Looking at a boat anchor is what you're doing." Earl laughed, kicking one of the tracks with the toe of his polished boot. A shower of rust flakes fell to the ground. "I heard you were thinking about clearing that swamp of yours. You ain't gonna do it with this piece of junk. You need real power. My new 1466 would pull stumps faster than this thing could start, if it ever started again." The International 1466, a monster of a tractor, turbocharged, 145 horsepower at the PTO, with a climate-controlled cab that had a radio and a cup holder. It was the talk of the county, and it was financed to the hilt, just like everything else Earl owned. "I like to own my iron, Earl, not rent it from the bank," Silas said, his voice low and even. Earl's grin tightened. "That's old-time thinking, Si. You gotta use leverage, OPM, other people's money. That's how you get ahead. While you're out here playing in the junkyard, I'm closing on the Henderson place. Another quarter section. The bank loves me." Silas knew it was true. The farm credit man, Mr. Abernathy, treated Earl like a king, while he looked at Silas over his spectacles like he was a bug to be squashed. "What'll you take for it, Walt?" Silas asked, turning his back on Earl. Miller took the cigar from his mouth. "Scrap price, $400, and you haul it." $400. It was nearly every cent Silas had in his savings account, the account he and his wife Mary kept for emergencies. This felt like the definition of an emergency. "You're crazy," Earl scoffed. "You'll spend 10 times that just getting it to move, and it'll still be a worthless piece of junk." Silas looked at the Dozer again. He saw past the rust and the weeds. He saw the thick, honest steel. He saw the simple, brutal power sleeping in that Detroit engine. He saw the 40 acres of rich black soil hidden under that swamp. He saw a way out. A hard way, but his way. "I'll take it," Silas said to Miller, pulling a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. Earl just shook his head, a look of pity and contempt on his face, and walked back to his shiny new truck. As he drove away, Silas could feel the man's judgment hanging in the dusty air. He was the fool, the stubborn old dinosaur who refused to adapt, the man who'd rather buy a corpse from a scrapyard than sign a note at the bank. Now, before we get into the grease and the grit of bringing that old iron back to life, I gotta ask you folks, have you ever taken on a project so big, so crazy, that everyone around you, your friends, your neighbors, maybe even your own family, called you a fool? Let me know down in the comments. I'm real curious to hear if I'm the only stubborn old mule out there. Getting the HD6 home was the first battle in a long and dirty war. It weighed 10 tons, and Silas's biggest piece of equipment was his single-axle grain truck, which would have buckled under the load. He ended up paying a heavy hauler from Grand Island $50, another painful bite out of his dwindling cash reserve, to winch it onto a lowboy trailer and creep the 10 miles to the farm. They deposited it in the grassy area behind his machine shed, where it promptly sank 6 inches into the soft earth, looking even more permanent and immovable than it had at the scrapyard. For the first week, Silas did nothing but stare at it. He'd finish his chores, milking the 10 cows he kept and feeding the hogs, and then he'd walk out with a cup of coffee and just circle the machine. He was taking its measure, learning its wounds. He bought a service manual for $5 through the mail, a thin, grease-stained book that became his Bible. The first order of business was the engine, the Detroit 371. Earl Thompson's taunts about it never starting again echoed in his head. Silas started by draining the fluids. The oil came out like black sludge, thick and gritty. The radiator was full of a rusty, scaly soup. He pulled the valve cover and his heart sank a little. A film of hardened, rust-colored moisture covered everything. Water had gotten in. He spent 2 days just cleaning. He scraped gaskets, wire-brushed rocker arms, and soaked the push rods in diesel fuel. Then came the head. The manual said to use a special tool. Silas had a long breaker bar and a piece of pipe for leverage. The head bolts groaned in protest, screaming like tortured animals as they broke loose from decades of rust. When he finally lifted the head off with his engine hoist, he saw the problem Miller had mentioned. A hairline crack ran between the exhaust valve seat and the injector port on the number 2 cylinder. He took the head into town to the machine shop. Gus, the machinist, a man with hands as thick as cinder blocks, whistled through his teeth. "That's a bad one, Si. I can try to pin it, but no guarantees. Might be better to find another head." "Where am I going to find a head for a 30-year-old Alice Chalmers?" Silas asked. "Good point," Gus conceded. "Leave it with me. It'll be a week, and it'll be $150. Another gut punch. That was his seed money for next spring's soybeans. He told Gus to do it, feeling the financial noose tighten around his neck. While the head was at the shop, Silas turned his attention to the fuel and air systems. The fuel tank was a horror show of varnish and rust. He unbolted it, wrestled it to the ground, and spent an entire afternoon sloshing it out with gravel and diesel fuel until the liquid finally ran clear. The blower, the heart of the two-stroke Detroit, was stiff. He carefully disassembled it, cleaning the rotors and checking the seals, re-lubricating everything with fresh oil. He replaced every fuel line, every hose clamp, knowing that a single air bubble could keep the stubborn diesel from ever firing. Every evening, Earl Thompson would drive by on the county road. His new 1466 would be pulling a massive disc, turning over soil with an effortless roar. He'd slow down as he passed Silas's place, and Silas could feel his condescending gaze on the disemboweled yellow machine in the yard. The message was clear. That's what you get for being a stubborn fool. The whispers at the co-op were just as bad. Heard Silas Blackwood's trying to raise the dead, one farmer chuckled while waiting for his fertilizer. That old Dozer's gonna be his tombstone. Even Mary, his wife, was starting to show the strain. She never said a word against him, but he saw it in her eyes when she brought him a glass of iced tea in the evenings. He'd be covered head to toe in grease, a fresh gash on his knuckles, staring into the guts of the machine. She'd look from him to the growing stack of bills on the kitchen table, and her smile wouldn't quite reach her eyes. "Are you sure about this, Silas?" she asked one night, her voice quiet. "It's the only way, Mary," he said, his own voice raspy with fatigue. "That back 40 is the key. If I can get that cleared, we can plant another 30 acres of corn. That's enough to tell the bank to go to hell." He finally got the machined head back from Gus. It looked clean, the crack stitched with threaded pins, the surface milled flat and true. He spent a full day meticulously cleaning the block deck, installing the new head gasket, and torquing the bolts down in the precise sequence the manual demanded. He set the valve lash and timed the injectors, his fingers moving with a slow, deliberate confidence. He installed new filters, filled the radiator with fresh coolant, and poured 5 gallons of clean Dello 400 oil into the crankcase. The moment of truth arrived on a humid Saturday afternoon. He'd wrestled a heavy-duty battery out of his grain truck and clamped on the cables. He checked the fuel rack, made sure the emergency shutdown was open. He took a deep breath, the smell of fresh paint from the valve cover and old diesel filling his lungs. He climbed onto the torn operator's seat, the steel hot enough to burn through his jeans. He pushed the throttle lever forward and hit the starter button. The starter motor groaned, a low, painful sound. The big engine turned over slowly. Once, twice, fighting decades of inertia. A puff of stale air coughed from the exhaust stack. He held the button down. The groaning continued, the battery straining. It wasn't going to catch. His heart hammered against his ribs. Earl was right. The whole town was right. It was a boat anchor. He let off the button, the silence that followed roaring in his ears. He was about to climb down in defeat when he remembered something an old trucker told him once about starting stubborn Detroits. He grabbed a can of ether from the shed. He gave a tiny 1-second spray into the air intake before the blower. He knew it was dangerous. Too much could blow the head right off. He climbed back up, said a quick prayer, and hit the starter again. The engine spun, coughed, and then it happened. A single cylinder fired with a sharp bark, then another. A cloud of black, oily smoke erupted from the stack, followed by a chaotic, clattering roar that shook the very ground. The 371 was alive. It was rough, shaking the whole 10-ton machine like a wet dog, but it was running. The sound was deafening, a hammering, high-pitched scream unique to the two-stroke Detroits. It wasn't a rumble, it was a declaration of war. Silas broke into a wide, grease-stained grin. He felt a surge of triumph so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He'd done it. He'd brought the dead back to life. The sound of that engine was the sweetest music he'd ever heard. It was the sound of a fighting chance. The year turned to 1974, and then 75. The world, it seemed, had gone corn crazy. Grain prices, which had been creeping up since the big Russian wheat deal a few years back, went through the roof. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Boots was on the radio telling farmers to plant fence-row to fence-row. Land prices soared. A sense of boundless optimism, fueled by easy credit and global demand, swept through the heartland. For men like Earl Thompson, it was a golden age. He used his soaring land values as collateral to borrow more and more money. The John Deere dealer delivered a brand-new 4630 tractor to his farm, followed by a 6-row planter and a 7700 combine that was bigger than Silas's entire machine shed. Earl was farming 1,000 acres now, all of it leveraged, all of it humming with the sound of new, powerful machinery. At the town cafe, he held court, talking about futures markets and expansion, laughing about how the old ways of farming were dead. "You gotta get big or get out," he'd proclaim, and the other farmers, mesmerized by his success, would nod in agreement. Silas, meanwhile, was at war with his back 40. Getting the engine running was just the first victory. Now came the grinding day-in, day-out campaign against the land itself. The HD6's tracks were still a problem. He spent weeks working on them, heating the seized pins with a rosebud torch until they glowed cherry red, then driving them out with a 20-pound sledgehammer. Each swing was a bone-jarring impact that sent shockwaves up his arms. He'd work until his hands were numb and his back was a solid knot of pain, then fall into bed, only to get up and do it again the next day. Once the dozer could move reliably, the real work began. He started at the edge of the swamp, the big Alice Chalmers growling, its exhaust stack puffing out rings of blue smoke. He'd drop the big bucket, feel the machine shudder as the cutting edge bit into the earth and push. He cleared brush, toppled 30-foot cottonwoods, and unearthed rocks the size of his farmall's rear tire. It was slow, brutal work. A good day meant clearing 1/4 of an acre. The fuel costs were staggering. The hungry Detroit diesel drank 5 gallons an hour, and diesel prices were climbing right along with everything else. The extra money Silas made from the high grain prices on his existing fields didn't go toward a new pickup or a vacation. It went straight into the fuel tank of the HD6, or to pay for welding rods to repair a crack in the loader arm, or a new set of hydraulic hoses after an old one burst, spraying hot, stinking oil all over him and the engine. From the road it looked like madness. While his neighbors were racing to get their crops in the ground with modern, efficient equipment, Silas was spending his precious spring days wrestling with a single stubborn stump, the old dozer roaring and straining. Earl would drive by in his air-conditioned cab, listening to the radio, and shake his head at the sight of Silas, covered in mud and sweat, fighting his lonely battle. To Earl, and to most everyone else, Silas was missing the boat. He was a fool wasting the best farming years in a generation on a patch of worthless swamp with a piece of junk. But they didn't see what Silas saw. With every stump he ripped from the ground, with every load of black, rich soil he pushed into a low spot, he was creating something. He was building new land. He dug drainage ditches, channeling the swamp water into the creek that ran along the property line. Slowly, painstakingly, the soggy ground began to dry out. The 40 acres of wasteland was shrinking, and in its place a field was being born. By the fall of 1976, he had cleared and drained nearly 30 acres. It was rough, pocked with roots and rocks, but it was usable. He spent the autumn ploughing it for the first time, his old Farmall M straining but getting the job done. The soil was incredible, deep, black and rich with decades of natural compost. He was making progress, but he felt like he was running in place. The high prices and inflation cut both ways. His inputs, seed, fertilizer, fuel, cost more than ever. The bank, seeing the boom all around them, had raised the interest rate on his small operating loan. The foreclosure letters had stopped, but the pressure was still there, a constant low hum of anxiety beneath the roar of his machinery. He was debt-free on his land and equipment, but cash poor, living on the edge while men like Earl Thompson were living high on the hog. One evening in the late summer of 1978, Silas was at the co-op, getting a hydraulic fitting, when he overheard the manager talking to Earl. The manager, a man named Henderson, who usually had a smile for his best customers, looked worried. "The prime rate went up another 1/4 point today, Earl," Henderson said, his voice low. "The boys at the bank are starting to get nervous about these variable rate loans." Earl just laughed it off. "Don't you worry about me, Frank. Prices are going to stay high forever. Land's the only thing they're not making more of. You got to spend money to make money." Silas paid for his fitting and left, the words echoing in his mind. Prime rate, variable rate loans. He didn't understand all the financial jargon, but he understood the look on Henderson's face. It was the same look he saw in his own mirror some mornings. It was the look of a man walking on a high wire, suddenly aware of how far down the ground was. That night, he worked late on the dozer, welding a new plate onto the bucket. The sun had set, and the machine shed was lit by a single bare bulb. He shut off the welder, the sudden silence broken only by the chirping of crickets. He walked outside and looked west, toward Earl's farm. A new set of massive mercury vapor yard lights lit up his whole operation like a baseball stadium. It was a monument to prosperity, built on a mountain of debt. Then he looked south at his own land. The 30 new acres lay dark and quiet under the stars, waiting for spring planting. It was his, every square inch of it, paid for not with a banker's pen, but with his own sweat, grease, and blood. A cold wind blew in from the north, carrying the first hint of autumn. Something was changing. He could feel it in his bones, a deep, unsettling shift, like the drop in pressure before a bad storm. He didn't know what was coming, but as he stood there in the quiet dark, he felt a knot of cold dread tighten in his stomach. The boom times, he suspected, were not going to last forever. The summer of 1980 arrived like a hammer blow. The sky turned a pale, hazy white and stayed that way. The rain stopped in May, and by July, the corn in the fields began to show the strain, the broad leaves curling inward during the heat of the day, a desperate attempt to conserve moisture. It was a brutal, soul-crushing drought that baked the rich black soil into something resembling concrete. For Earl Thompson, the drought was a test of his modern empire. His 6 new center-pivot irrigation systems, great steel insects crawling across the landscape, became his lifeline. They ran 24 hours a day, hissing water onto the thirsty crops, their electric motors humming a constant expensive song. His power bills soared to levels that would have been unthinkable just a few years prior. The water table dropped, and his deep wells began to suck air, the pumps groaning in protest. Out in the fields, the massive tires of his new international tractors compacted the baked earth, creating a hardpan that the precious, expensive water struggled to penetrate. Silas had no irrigation. He couldn't afford it and wouldn't have borrowed the money for it if he could. He watched his own corn suffer, the stalks shorter than they should be, the ears smaller. But on the 30 acres of bottomland he had clawed back from the swamp, the story was different. That land, rich with decades of humus and natural organic matter, acted like a sponge. It held the winter moisture deep within its black heart, rationing it out to the roots of his crop. His yield would be down, he knew that, but his costs were a tiny fraction of Earl's. He was burning $50 bills. Earl was burning thousands. The machines began to feel the strain, too. One sweltering afternoon, Earl's prized 1466 tractor, the one he'd boasted about so loudly, sputtered to a stop in the middle of a field. A complex seal in the hydraulic torque amplifier had failed. It wasn't a part you could find at the local auto supply. The dealer had to send a mechanic out from Grand Island, who spent a day diagnosing the problem before ordering the part from a warehouse in Moline, Illinois. For 5 critical days of cultivating, the 1,000-acre operation was crippled, waiting on a $5 rubber seal buried deep in the guts of a $100,000 machine. A week later, Silas had his own breakdown. He was using the old HD6 to clear a fence row when the main hydraulic line leading to one of the lift cylinders blew. It went with a bang, like a shotgun blast, and in seconds, the side of the engine was drenched in hot black fluid. The big loader arm sagged to the ground, useless. Earl, driving by on the county road, slowed his pickup and watched for a moment, a flicker of his old smugness returning to his face. Another failure for the junkyard machine. But Silas didn't call a dealer. He walked back to his shed, grabbed a set of wrenches and a spare length of high-pressure hose he'd bought years ago, just in case. He unscrewed the ruined line, getting soaked in the residual oil. He measured and cut the new hose, carefully crimped on the old fittings using a vise and a hammer, and wrestled it back into place between the engine block and the loader frame. He topped off the hydraulic reservoir with 5 gallons of fluid, fired up the screaming Detroit, and by sunset he was back at work. The repair had cost him $20 and an afternoon of sweat. The first real cracks in Earl's empire appeared not in his fields, but on paper. He was late on his fuel bill at the co-op. It was only a week, but Frank Henderson, the manager, noticed. Then he was 2 weeks late. Henderson stopped smiling when Earl came in. The whispers started at the cafe, quiet at first, then growing more confident. Heard Earl's stretched a little thin. Those interest rates are eating him alive. Earl's swagger was gone, replaced by a permanent frown etched onto his sunburnt face. He was seen leaving the Farm Credit Office one afternoon, his face pale and grim. The high wire he'd been walking on for years was starting to sway in the wind. The drought finally broke in late August with a storm of biblical fury. Thunderheads the color of bruises boiled up in the west, and the wind that came before them tasted of dust and electricity. The rain came not as a gentle relief, but as a punishing assault, hammering the dry fields with sheets of water that ran off the compacted soil, taking tons of precious topsoil with it. When it was over, Silas walked his fields. His crop was battered, but the ground had soaked up most of the water. He had a harvest, not a great one, but enough to pay his property taxes and put a little away for next year. Earl had a harvest too, a huge one, thanks to his pivots. But when he sat down with his ledger, the numbers told a terrifying story. The cost of electricity, fuel, and repairs had consumed every last cent of profit. He had produced a mountain of grain and hadn't made a dime. He was deeper in debt than when the year had started. The storm had passed, but for Earl Thompson and thousands of farmers just like him, the real hurricane was just beginning to make landfall. The years 1981 and 1982 were not a storm. They were an apocalypse. To fight runaway inflation, the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. cranked interest rates to levels unseen in living memory. The prime rate, the number that governed everything, soared past 20%. For the farmers who had built their empires on the promise of cheap, easy credit, it was a death sentence. The variable rate loans they had signed so eagerly just a few years before, the ones that had allowed them to buy the new tractors and the extra land, became anchors that dragged them into the abyss. Simultaneously, the bottom fell out of the grain market. A government embargo against the Soviet Union slammed the door on a major export customer, and a global recession crushed demand. Prices that had seemed perpetually high collapsed. Corn that was selling for over $3 a bushel was now barely fetching $2. And then the final blow. Land values, which had been the bedrock of farm credit for a generation, plummeted by as much as 60%. Men like Earl Thompson were trapped. They owed $3,000 an acre for land that was now worth barely $1,000. Their monthly payments, tied to that sky-high prime rate, had doubled, then tripled. They were losing money on every bushel they sold and sinking deeper into a hole of debt from which there was no escape. The music had stopped, and they were left holding all the notes. The banker, Mr. Abernathy, who had once taken Earl out for steak dinners and encouraged him to leverage his assets, was now a different man. His voice on the phone was cold, his letters filled with curt, legalistic phrases. Failure to remit, acceleration of your debt, foreclosure proceedings. It wasn't personal, Abernathy assured him. It was just business. The end came on a cold, windswept Saturday in November. An auction, the ultimate indignity for a farmer. Silas watched from the county road, parked in his old pickup. He didn't want to be there, but he felt a grim obligation to bear witness. Earl's gleaming fleet of red International Harvester machines was lined up in the yard, their paint still shiny, their tires still black. They looked like soldiers waiting for an execution. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man in a cowboy hat, stood on a flatbed trailer, his rhythmic chant echoing across the somber crowd of farmers. They stood in small, quiet groups, their faces grim. They weren't there for bargains, they were there to watch a neighbor's life be dismantled, knowing full well it could be their turn next. All right, folks, here we have it. A 7700 turbo combine, field-ready, a real clean machine. What'll you give me for it? The bidding was slow, pathetic. Machines that Earl had paid over $100,000 for just a few years ago were selling for $20,000, maybe $30,000. The big 1466 tractor, the symbol of Earl's ambition, sold for a quarter of what he still owed on it. Silas saw Earl standing near the back porch of his house, his hands shoved in his pockets, his shoulders slumped. He looked like a stranger on his own farm. His wife came out and put a hand on his arm, and he flinched, unable to look at her. Silas was insulated from it all. The low grain prices hurt, but they didn't threaten him. He had no payments to make. His property taxes were manageable. His fuel and seed costs were a pittance compared to what Earl had been spending. The 30 acres of bottomland, cleared with his own sweat and the labor of the old yellow Dozer, was his savings account. It produced reliably, and every dollar it earned was his to keep. He wasn't triumphant. Watching the auction, seeing the vultures from the banks and the equipment dealers picking over the bones of Earl's dream filled him with a profound sadness. Earl hadn't been a bad man, just a proud one. He had believed the experts, the bankers, the magazines that all preached the same gospel: get big or get out. He had played the game by their rules, and when the rules changed overnight, they had crucified him for it. That night, after the last of the trucks had hauled away the last piece of Earl's life, Silas sat in his machine shed. The air was cold and smelled of diesel and iron. Mary found him there, sitting on an overturned bucket, staring at the HD6. It sat in its usual corner, quiet and unassuming, a film of dust on its scarred yellow paint. "It's a terrible thing," she said softly, standing beside him. Silas nodded, not looking up. "He did everything they told him to do," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "He just believed the promises. He believed you could build a farm on a handshake from a banker." He reached out and laid a hand on the cold steel of the Dozer's track. "This thing, it never promised me anything but a sore back and greasy hands." But it never lied. He felt no joy in his neighbor's ruin, only a deep, chilling understanding of how close he himself had come to the edge, and a quiet, profound gratitude for the stubbornness that had saved him. A month after the auction, a car Silas didn't recognize pulled into his driveway. It was Mr. Abernathy, the banker. He looked older than Silas remembered, his suit jacket rumpled, the confidence gone from his eyes. He got out of the car carrying a briefcase, looking around the modest farmstead as if seeing it for the first time. "Silas," he said, extending a hand that felt soft and damp. "Got a minute?" They sat at the kitchen table, Mary pouring coffee into 2 mugs. Abernathy cleared his throat and opened his briefcase. "As you know," he began, avoiding Silas's gaze, "the bank has taken possession of the Thompson property. The home quarter section, that is. The one bordering your land to the west." Silas just nodded, sipping his coffee. "Frankly, Silas, the market is dead. We can't find a buyer willing to take on that kind of debt load, even at a reduced price. We're looking for a quick, clean sale. To a solvent operator." He finally looked up. "We know you're in a unique position, no leverage. Some cash reserves. The bank has authorized me to offer you the entire 160 acres, house and barns included, for a price you won't believe." He slid a piece of paper across the table. Silas looked at the number. It was less than what people were paying for bare land 10 years ago. It was a fire sale price, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. But Silas didn't answer right away. He thanked Abernathy for the coffee and told him he'd think about it. The next morning, he drove his pickup into town. He didn't go to the bank. He went to a small, run-down rental house on the edge of town where he knew Earl and his family were now living. He found Earl in the backyard, trying to fix a broken lawnmower. He looked thin, defeated. "Earl," Silas said, his voice quiet. Earl looked up, startled. His face was a mixture of shame and resentment. "What do you want, Silas? Come to gloat?" "No," Silas said, shaking his head. "I came to talk business. Abernathy came to see me yesterday. He offered me your place." Earl's face hardened. He dropped the wrench he was holding. "So you're going to pick the bones, just like everyone else?" "I haven't decided yet," Silas said. He took a deep breath. "Look, Earl, I'm thinking about it. But if I do it, I'm going to need help. I can't farm 500 acres by myself. You know that land better than God does. I'd like to offer you a job, a full-time wage. Help me run the place." Earl stared at him, his mouth slightly open. He looked from Silas's face to his calloused hands, searching for a trick, for some hidden mockery. He found none. He saw only a plain-spoken offer from one farmer to another. The hardness in his eyes seemed to melt, replaced by a sheen of moisture. He swallowed hard and looked away, at the peeling paint on the back of the little rental house. "Why?" Earl asked, his voice choked. "Because nobody should lose their home," Silas said simply. "And because you're a damn good farmer. You just listened to the wrong people." 2 days later, Silas walked into the farm credit office. He sat down across from Abernathy and pushed the offer sheet back across the desk. "I'll take it," he said. Abernathy smiled, relieved. "Excellent. We can draw up the financing papers right away. At the current rates." "Won't be needing any papers," Silas interrupted, pulling a thick bank book from his coat pocket. "I'm paying cash." The banker's jaw dropped. Silas laid the book on the desk. It was the account he and Mary had kept for emergencies, the one he'd nearly emptied to buy the Dozer years ago. It had been slowly refilled, year after year, with the profits from the 30 acres of bottomland, the money earned by the old yellow machine. He was buying Earl's dream, not with other people's money, but with his own sweat, distilled into paper. The story spread through the county like wildfire. Silas Blackwood, the stubborn old fool, had bought the Thompson place, and he'd hired Earl to help him run it. At the co-op and the cafe, the talk was different now. The men who had chuckled at his Junkyard project now spoke his name with a quiet awe. He hadn't just survived, he had prevailed. He had become a symbol of something they thought was lost, a quiet strength, a deep-rooted wisdom that had nothing to do with the size of your tractor or the scale of your debt. The years rolled on. The farm crisis slowly faded, leaving deep scars on the community. Some families left for good, their names vanishing from the mailboxes on the county roads. But the Blackwood farm thrived. Silas and Earl, an unlikely pair, worked side by side. The old rivalry was gone, buried under years of shared work and mutual respect. They were two sides of the same coin, one who had weathered the storm by staying close to shore, the other who had been shipwrecked and rescued. One warm evening in the late 1980s, Silas was in the machine shed with his son, David, now a tall young man with his father's quiet eyes. David was learning the ways of the farm, his future tied to this land. "Dad," David asked, running a hand over the fender of their new-to-them case tractor, a solid, reliable machine Silas had bought for cash at an auction. "Why do we still keep that old thing?" He nodded toward the corner where the HD6 sat, a silent yellow monument. Silas picked up a wrench and wiped it with a rag. "Because that old thing has a story to tell," he said. He walked over and patted the Dozer's scarred bucket. The steel was cool under his palm. "This new tractor," he said, gesturing with the wrench, "is an asset. It helps us make a living. But that machine over there, that's a lesson. It taught me that the shiniest paint and the biggest engine don't mean a thing if you don't own it, body and soul. It taught me that you don't build a future with a loan application. You build it with your own 2 hands, one rock, one stump at a time." He looked at his son, his gaze serious. "Never let a banker talk you into betting the farm, son. Own what you work and work what you own. The land doesn't care about your line of credit. It only answers to sweat." Years later, Silas was an old man. His hair was white, and his hands were gnarled, but his back was still straight. It was a late summer evening, the kind of evening that feels like a blessing. He walked slowly to the edge of the west field, the field that had once been Earl's, the field he had bought with Dozer money. The corn stood tall and heavy, the leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. In the distance, he could see the lights of a tractor as David did the evening chores. He bent down and scooped up a handful of the soil. It was dark and cool and rich, flowing through his fingers like grains of black gold. This was real. This was permanent. He could smell the earth and the corn, and in the quiet of the evening, if he listened closely, he could almost hear it. The memory of a sound. The chaotic, hammering roar of a 2-stroke Detroit diesel. The clank of steel tracks and the groan of the earth giving way. It was the sound of a legacy being forged, not in a bank, but in a scrapyard, by a stubborn man who dared to believe in the power of old iron and his own 2 hands. The foreclosure was silenced. The land was resurrected, and here, under the vast Nebraska sky, was the peace he had earned.